The roads of southwestern France in early June 1944 bore little resemblance to the killing fields of Normandy. Here, 200 miles south of the invasion beaches, the countryside rolled in gentle waves of green pasture and stone villages that had weathered centuries without bearing witness to mechanized slaughter. The war had touched this region through occupation, through rationing, through the quiet disappearance of young men into forced labor camps or resistance cells, but the ancient market towns along the Vienne River had been spared the physical devastation that had consumed so much of Europe. Oradour-sur-Glane was one such place. A village of modest prosperity, it sat astride the road between Limoges and Angoulême, its population normally numbering around 650 souls, but swelled in recent months by refugees fleeing cities to the north and east. On the morning of June 10, 1944, the village prepared for a Saturday like any other under occupation. Children attended school. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Farmers tended livestock in surrounding fields. The war seemed distant, an abstraction spoken of in hushed tones, but not yet made concrete in the destruction of homes or the massacre of neighbors. The 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich had been stationed in Montauban, far to the south, when word of the Allied landings reached German commanders on June 6. Orders came immediately. The division was to move north with all possible speed to reinforce German defenses in Normandy, to help throw the invaders back into the sea before they could establish an unbreakable foothold on French soil. But the route north proved far more hazardous than any map suggested. The French resistance, emboldened by news of the invasion and supplied by Allied airdrops, had transformed the roads of central France into a lethal obstacle course. Bridges were demolished, telephone lines were cut, small arms fire erupted from tree lines and stone walls, then melted away before German forces could respond with overwhelming firepower. The harassment was constant, maddening, and effective. A journey that should have taken days stretched into a week, then longer. Casualties mounted not from pitched battles, but from the invisible war of ambush and sabotage. The men of des Reich, many of them hardened veterans of the Eastern Front where partisan warfare had been met with the most savage reprisals, grew increasingly frustrated and angry. Their officers, under pressure from higher command to reach Normandy before the Allied beachhead became impregnable, demanded harsher measures against the civilian population they believed was sheltering and supporting the resistance fighters. On June 9th, in the town of Toul, elements of des Reich had hanged 99 men from lampposts and balconies in retaliation for resistance activity. The bodies swayed above the cobblestone streets throughout the afternoon, a grotesque warning to any who might consider further acts of defiance. But the hangings at Toul did not satisfy the rage building within certain units of the division, nor did it slow the pace of resistance attacks. Battalion Commander Adolf Diekmann, leading the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment, received reports on the evening of June 9th that suggested German officers or soldiers might be held prisoner in villages near Limoges. The intelligence was vague, unconfirmed, built on rumor and the paranoid assumptions of an occupying force that saw enemies in every shadow. Whether Diekmann believed these reports or simply seized upon them as justification for an action already contemplated remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that, on the morning of June 10th, he assembled his battalion and directed them toward Oradour-sur-Glane. The village had no strategic value. It harbored no resistance headquarters. Its selection appears to have been arbitrary, a consequence of proximity and misidentification, though some historians suggest Diekmann may have confused it with Oradour-sur-Glane, a village 7 miles distant where resistance activity had been reported. If confusion played a role, no effort was made to verify the target before action commenced. The inhabitants of Oradour-sur-Glane first became aware of the German presence shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Armored vehicles and trucks filled with SS troops entered the village from multiple directions, sealing off roads and establishing a perimeter that made departure impossible. Soldiers moved through the streets, knocking on doors, ordering residents into the town square. The fairground, the village's central gathering place, began to fill with men, women, and children roused from their Saturday routines. Farmers were pulled from fields. Shopkeepers left their counters. The schoolmaster dismissed his students, but there was nowhere for them to go except into the growing crowd assembling under the watchful eye of armed troops. Refugees who had sought safety in Oradour-sur-Glane found themselves trapped alongside native villagers, their earlier flight from danger culminating in this forced assembly. Soldiers moved methodically, searching homes and outbuildings, dragging out anyone who attempted to hide. The elderly and infirm were carried into the square on chairs or supported by neighbors. Babies were held in their mothers' arms. The entire population of the village, swollen by the presence of refugees and visitors, gathered in the June sunshine while German officers consulted maps and gave orders in voices too low for the frightened crowd to comprehend. Diekmann addressed the assembled villagers through an interpreter. Identity documents were to be examined, he announced. This was a routine security check. There was nothing to fear if one had done nothing wrong. The reassurance did little to calm the rising anxiety among people who understood that German security checks often preceded deportations to labor camps or worse. But armed soldiers surrounded the square, and resistance was inconceivable. The crowd remained docile, waiting to learn what fate the afternoon held. Then came the separation. Women and children were ordered to the church. Men were divided into smaller groups and marched to various buildings around the village. Barns, workshops, garages. The splitting of families proceeded with mechanical efficiency, mothers calling out to husbands and sons, children crying as fathers disappeared down side streets escorted by soldiers with rifles at the ready. The Church of Oradour-sur-Glane, a modest stone structure typical of rural French parishes, received several hundred women and children through its heavy wooden doors. They filled the pews and the aisles and the spaces between, pressed together in the dim interior, their voices rising in anxious murmurs that echoed off vaulted ceilings. Soldiers took up positions outside, blocking the exits, their presence transforming the house of worship into a prison. In the barns and garages scattered throughout the village, the men of Oradour-sur-Glane faced machine guns. The weapons had been set up while the men were being marched into position, tripod-mounted and aimed at chest height. There was no announcement, no explanation, no opportunity for final words. The firing began simultaneously across multiple locations, a coordinated execution that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. Bodies fell in heaps as bullets tore through flesh and bone at close range. Those not killed instantly by the initial volleys were finished with rifle fire or left to die, as soldiers piled straw and kindling over the corpses and set them ablaze. The flames consumed evidence and remains alike, reducing human beings to charred fragments barely recognizable as having once been alive. In the garage on the Rue de Pirat, where nearly 20 men had been herded together, the machine gun fire was so intense that bullets passed through bodies and scarred the stone walls behind them. One man, wounded but conscious, lay beneath the dead and dying as fire began to spread. He waited until soldiers departed, then crawled through a gap in the wall and fled across fields toward the Glane River. His survival would later provide testimony to what had occurred in those killing spaces. At the church, the women and children heard the gunfire. The sound was unmistakable, prolonged, coming from multiple directions. Panic seized the congregation. Mothers gathered children close. Prayers were whispered or sobbed aloud. Some pounded on the locked doors, begging to be released, though whether they believed escape was possible or simply could not bear to remain trapped is impossible to know. The soldiers outside the church did not respond to the pleas. They waited for orders, their faces betraying nothing of what was about to unfold. Then soldiers entered the church carrying a large box or crate, awkward and heavy, which they placed in the center aisle before withdrawing and barring the doors from outside. Witnesses who survived the next moments disagreed about the exact nature of what occurred, their memories fractured by trauma and the chaos of fire and death. What is certain is that an explosion tore through the church's interior, not powerful enough to collapse the structure, but sufficient to ignite the wooden pews and furnishings, and to release some form of smoke or gas that quickly made breathing difficult. The blast may have been intended to kill outright or merely to create panic and chaos. It achieved both. Women and children stumbled through thickening smoke, gasping for air, pressing toward windows too small and too high to offer escape. Soldiers outside opened fire through the windows and doorways, shooting indiscriminately into the suffocating mass of humanity trapped within. Bullets struck mothers shielding their children, grandmothers attempting to break through doors, teenagers trying to reach windows. The firing continued even as flames spread through the church's interior, consuming tapestries and wooden statuary and the bodies of those already dead or dying. One woman, Marguerite Rouffanche, managed to reach a window behind the altar. How she climbed to that height amid the carnage remains unclear, adrenaline and desperation achieving what should have been physically impossible. She threw herself through the window and fell to the ground outside, injuring herself in the landing but conscious and able to move. Soldiers saw her immediately and opened fire. Bullets struck her multiple times, but she crawled into a garden and concealed herself among rows of peas, playing dead, while soldiers searched the grounds around the burning church. She would lie there for hours as the massacre continued elsewhere in the village, as flames consumed the church and everyone still trapped inside, as her wounds bled and shock threatened to steal consciousness. A handful of others escaped through similar combinations of chance and determination, men who fled the barns before fire consumed them or children who hid in places soldiers failed to search. But the survivors numbered fewer than 10 from a village population that had exceeded 600 that afternoon. The soldiers of WWII moved through Oradour-sur-Glane with systematic thoroughness. Buildings were torched. Livestock were shot in their pens or left to burn in stables. The small number of residents who had hidden successfully during the initial roundup were hunted down and killed when discovered. A mother and her infant, found hiding in a cupboard, were shot and their bodies thrown onto a burning pyre. An elderly woman too ill to be moved from her bed was burned alive when soldiers set fire to her home. The killing was personal and impersonal at once, individual murders committed within a framework of collective destruction that reduced the village to ash and corpses. By nightfall, Oradour-sur-Glane was a smoking ruin. The church stood as a blackened shell, its roof collapsed, its interior filled with the intermingled remains of hundreds of women and children burned beyond individual recognition. The barns and garages held similar horrors, charred bones and melted metal fused together by heat intense enough to warp iron and crack stone. The village's streets, so ordinary that morning, were littered with spent shell casings and the belongings of the dead. Eyeglasses, shoes, toys dropped by children who would never reclaim them. The battalion departed before dawn on June 11th, continuing its journey north toward Normandy. They left behind no occupation force, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had been done. The ruins smoldered for days, thick smoke visible from neighboring villages whose residents initially feared to approach, uncertain whether German forces remained in the area. When survivors and investigators finally entered Oradour-sur-Glane, they found a landscape of death unprecedented in the history of German occupation in France. 642 people had been murdered. Among them were more than 200 children, the youngest only 7 days old. Entire families had been eradicated. Bloodlines that had persisted in the region for centuries ended in the space of an afternoon. The scale of the atrocity shocked even a nation that had endured 4 years of occupation, deportation, and resistance reprisals. This was not the execution of hostages, not the burning of a suspected resistance hideout, not the rough justice of soldiers under fire. This was the deliberate annihilation of a community that posed no military threat, offered no resistance, and died without understanding why it had been chosen for destruction. French authorities sealed the site almost immediately. General Charles de Gaulle, leading the provisional government as France began its liberation, understood the value of preserving Oradour-sur-Glane exactly as the SS had left it. The ruins would serve as permanent testimony to what had occurred, a counter to any future attempt to minimize or deny the crimes committed during occupation. Forensic teams worked for weeks to recover and identify remains, a task made nearly impossible by the intensity of the fires. Bodies had been reduced to bone fragments. Personal effects were melted or burned beyond recognition. Many victims could be identified only through process of elimination, their presence in the village that day confirmed by neighbors or family members who had seen them entering the church or being marched to the barns. Mass graves received the remains, while the village itself was declared a national monument, its streets and buildings to be maintained as ruins for future generations to witness. The military necessity that allegedly drove Das Reich toward Normandy ultimately proved hollow. The division arrived too late to affect the outcome of the beach landings, its strength, sapped by constant harassment, and its reputation forever stained by actions at Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. Adolf Diekmann, the battalion commander who ordered the massacre, died in combat in Normandy weeks later, escaping earthly justice, but ensuring that questions about his motives and orders would never receive definitive answers. After the war, French authorities sought to prosecute those responsible for the atrocity. The trials proved frustratingly incomplete. Many of the soldiers involved had been killed in subsequent fighting. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. Those who were caught and tried offered contradictory testimony, some claiming they were following orders, others insisting they had no knowledge of what was planned until it began. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, their outcomes satisfying no one. Some perpetrators received significant sentences only to be released early as political considerations outweighed justice. Others were never identified or apprehended. The families of the victims watched as the machinery of law failed to deliver accountability proportional to the crime. Oradour-sur-Glane remains frozen in time, a ghost village maintained by the French government as both memorial and warning. The burned-out church still stands, its walls pocked with bullet holes, its interior open to the sky. Rusted automobiles sit where they were abandoned. Sewing machines rest in the remains of shops. The streetcar that ran through the village center decays slowly on its tracks, going nowhere, a monument to interrupted journeys and lives cut short. Visitors walk these streets in silence, confronted by the physical evidence of an atrocity that defies comprehension. The preserved ruins offer no comfort, no redemption, no suggestion that meaning can be extracted from such senseless violence. They simply exist, bearing witness to what occurred in a small French village on a summer afternoon in 1944.